Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's briefing about the role of foreign intervention in West Africa. It is a pleasure to have you all here today, and we have three terrific panelists that I will introduce shortly. First, I just wanted to make a brief introduction to Network 2020. So for those who are joining us for the first time, welcome. Network 2020 is a New York City-based nonprofit, and we're providing access to leading thinkers and doers in the international affairs space for our audiences in New York and around the world. So we're really trying to create more informed conversations about global affairs. So today we will be looking at instability in West Africa and international intervention, and we're really trying to dig into peace operations and other security measures and see what impact they have had on the region. We have three terrific experts with us today. So first, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kabir Adamu. Kabir is the Managing Director of Beacon Security and Intelligence Limited. He is an expert in enterprise security risk management and intelligence, as well as in national security solutions. He has led a security and intelligence team at the Office of the President of the Senate in Nigeria, and he holds a doctorate in strategic security risk management. So welcome, Kabir. Next, we have Dr. Nathaniel Allen. Nate is an associate professor at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, where he oversees academic programming on cyber issues and peace operations. His expertise includes cyber issues, emerging technology, civil-military relations, and regional security partnerships across Africa. So welcome, Nate. And last but not least, we have Dr. Sebastian Elischer, who is Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Florida. His work analyzes the interplay between identities and institutions, and he is particularly interested in how identities shape and affect democratization and other political dynamics in sub-Saharan Africa. So welcome, Sebastian. Thank you all for being here today. I'm going to start with you, Nate, because in 2022, France very publicly abandoned an 8-year peacekeeping operation in Mali, ousted in the aftermath of the third coup in the nation in just 10 years. However, this is but one of many operations that had been undertaken in West Africa in recent years. So could you just give us, set the scene for us? Who are the major international actors investing resources and manpower in West Africa? And what are some of the motivating factors that caused such an influx of foreign peace operations in West Africa?
Thank you very, very much, Courtney. A real pleasure to be with you here today and with Network 2020. I'm actually going to start by taking the last question first. So the main motivating factor behind the influx of foreign interventions in the Sahel, there are two. First, it's the spread of violent extremist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. And second, the seeming inability of governments in the region to deal with this metastasizing threat. These interventions, the current wave of them dates back to 2012, when the movement of arms and militants as a result of the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya sparked a Tuareg-led rebellion in Mali's north. The capture of Mali's north by these rebels, some of whom were affiliated with Al-Qaeda, sparked the first waves of foreign intervention. And over the past decade or so, I think 5 different actors are worth highlighting. First, early in 2013, the French launched a military operation, Operation Serval, in order to push the militants out of Mali's north. This was largely successful in retaking territory, but did not stop Islamist groups aligned with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State from eventually spreading further into parts of southern Mali and eventually into Niger, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, Nigeria, and Cameroon. Recognizing this in 2014, France replaced Serval with Operation Barkhane, which was meant to target Islamist groups in the greater region. That mission ended in 2022. A second major player has been the United Nations, who launched the multidimensional integrated stabilization mission in Mali, known as MENUSMA, in 2013, after a peace agreement was negotiated between Mali's government and separatists following Serval. And the main mandate of this mission, like most peacekeeping missions, is to keep the peace, not necessarily directly to confront extremist groups. And MENUSMA, this mission, recently ended in 2023 after being asked to leave by Mali's current government. Third, while the United States has not led any intervention per se, it has provided a significant amount of support and bilateral assistance. One program, the Trans-Sahelian Counterterrorism Partnership, actually dates back to well before the French intervention in 2012. And more recently, the US has stood up a drone base in Niger, which provides ISR bilateral support to address extremist groups. It was just asked to basically vacate this base this past week. Fourth, in more recent years, we've increasingly seen a role by Russia-backed private contractors and paramilitary groups such as Wagner, providing security provision and security cooperation, particularly with the military-led regimes in states like Mali, Burkina Faso, and now potentially Niger. And finally, last but not least, I would be remiss to not mention Africans themselves, right? Early in the conflict, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, intervened with Serval to address the civilization, the situation in the north. It eventually handed over authority to the UN. And it's also important to acknowledge the importance of ad hoc coalitions of African states, like the G5 Sahel Joint Force in the Sahel, the Multinational Joint Task Force in Nigeria, the Accra Initiative in coastal West Africa, and more recently, the Alliance of Sahelian States, all of which are kind of ad hoc collective security arrangements by African states themselves, aimed at one way or another to coordinate responses to the growing violent extremist and cross-border militant threat. So I'm there.
Perfect. Thank you. Kabir, I'd like to turn to you now and take a look on the ground. Could you please give us an overview, a brief overview of the security situation in West Africa and what role the recent government takeovers are playing within this larger story about security in the countries of West Africa?
Thank you very much, Courtney. I'm delighted to be here and to participate in this conversation. Of the 15, 16 countries in the West African sub-region, very few of them are not experiencing one or the other form of violence conflict, either rooted in Islamist ideological movements that are affiliated in one way or the other with the Islamic State and with the Islamic State franchise or the Al-Qaeda franchise. Apart from that, you have the foreig and sometimes nomadic groups that have also been weaponized and that are fighting either for control of territory or sometimes to influence the outcome of certain national issues, as is the case in some parts of Mali and of course in Niger and even in Nigeria. Then there is also the inter-community violence that is rooted in sometimes ethnic divisions or advantages that these ethnic divisions would want to achieve either for political reasons or sometimes just on the basis of land, dispute or acquisition. This is common in virtually all parts of West Africa. Add to that is also sometimes the issue regarding traditional leadership. In places like Ghana, parts of Sierra Leone and Liberia, Nigeria, you have such occurrences. So these types of conflict with recent developments, especially with the impact of climate change that is having in some of these communities, and then of course the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, some of which are coming through from collapsed or countries that are faced with this conflict, or others from even outside the sub-region, further entrenching this conflicts and leading to more violence. So this is unfortunately the situation across West Africa as a whole.
Okay, thank you very much. So it sounds like even when sometimes in the West or in the US, when we're saying, ISIS, we've dealt with it, sounds much more like the problem has just been pushed elsewhere in a way. So thank you for illuminating that. Sebastian, the Sahel specifically has seen, I think, a threefold rise in fatalities compared to 2020, at a time when I think there have been a lot of foreign intervention. So where are the region's most serious domestic and international threats coming from? And what has the regional and international response been? And if you could also talk a little bit within that, if applicable, because it's come up in some of the previous panelists' responses, the role of religious extremism. Is that a bigger factor than others or not? And how would you describe that?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you so much, Courtney, and a big thanks to the Network 2020 for having me and for having us. So talking about threats to the Sahel region more generally, I would distinguish between sort of lingering threats, so threats that have been around maybe since decolonization, and more acute threats. And sort of one lingering threat, so a lingering threat to the lives of many ordinary Sahelian citizens historically has been the state. There has been a lot of abuses by security forces against ordinary citizens, especially outside of the main cities. And so a lingering threat has been the lack of more broader popular legitimacy and trust in the security forces, with important long-term implications. Many of the countries in the Sahel, just like many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, do display parochial cleavages or ethnic cleavages. If we think about the conflict between the north and the south in Niger, and much more so in Mali, in Burkina Faso, that division is more based on economics rather than ethnic cleavages. But it is an important threat. And what plays into many of these conflicts is, of course, the lack of resources. On the one hand, the failure of former colonial powers to create viable states, but also the failure of the post-colonial elites to live up to the developmental promises. So those are lingering or structural threats that have been around for a long time. The more acute threats, and it is undoubtedly currently the most acute threat, is violent religious extremism, and both Nate and Kabir have already talked about this. So organizations or groups that are affiliated to Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or that are local jihadi cells that have been operated and that have been affecting the Sahel for more than a decade now. There have been various international responses. Nate talked about this. There have, of course, been regional responses. Unfortunately, I would argue that these responses have been somewhat disappointing. There was something like the G5 Sahel, which was an alliance between the 5 Sahel countries to come together to foster collaboration in the area of development, but also security. With the onset of what some people label the Coup surge in West Africa or in the Sahel, 3 countries now, so Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, have left the G5 Sahel or are no longer willing to contribute to it. ECOWAS has on several occasions tried to put together an intervention force, and that happened in the run-up to the French intervention in January 2013. But it also happened more recently in reaction to the military coup in Niger. And these attempts to put together a rapid reaction force did not materialize. And there are a lot of reasons for this. So in more recent years, part of that is the fact that the civilian governments in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso were overthrown by militaries that are distinctly anti-Western, that are distinctly anti-ECOWAS, anti-G5. But it's also due to the fact that ECOWAS, beyond its protocols and beyond kind of very sophisticated regional cooperation mechanisms, is lagging behind when it comes to political integration. And I think one of the major overlooked issue in the current conflict between ECOWAS and the junta governments is the fact that ECOWAS has very little political processing power. ECOWAS does not engage with a sufficient number of academics and think tanks in the region. And as a result, it always lags behind when it comes to designing viable political solutions. And it's become a very reactionary body when it comes to security and political issues. And that's first and foremost a capacity issue. So I leave it at that as a kind of first reaction to your questions.
Thank you. As a brief follow-up, and this may be a chicken and the egg question, but do you think it's more important to address the acute issues or the structural issues, or are the structural issues in a way being addressed by some of these takeovers?
That's a great question. I do think the acute issues, so violent Islamic extremism, ought to be addressed. The international communities and the Sahel governments and the governments of West Africa have tried to deal with that issue largely by resorting to hard security solutions, so by deploying the military. It's only in recent years that more soft solutions, so rehabilitation programs, closer coordination with religious leaders have played a role in this. But this really is the issue that ought to be addressed, because it's very evident from pretty much any security database that we have that violent Islamic extremism is spreading, and it's now increasingly affecting policy planning in many of the coastal West African states, Togo, Ivory Coast, even Ghana. And the problem has grown stronger, not weaker. And all the other more lingering threats, of course, have become worse because of this acute threat. So there is a lot of literature on the current conflict between herders and farmers in West Africa and the Sahel region, and a conflict that's grown worse because of climate change, but also because of population growth and because of the lack of resources. And the spread of jihadi ideology has created an ideological pretext that allows this conflict to escalate. And so I think the clear emphasis should be on containing what I've labeled the acute threat or violent religious extremism in the region.
Thank you for that clarification. Nate, turning to you, what do you see as the future of cooperation now in this current context to address shared security threats in the Sahel?
Thank you very, very much. So I think the region has really reached a critical juncture, and going forward, the face of regional cooperation and kind of foreign intervention is likely to look pretty different than what it has, at least for the past 20 years. First, I think it's reasonably clear that, at least for the time being, the era of large-scale interventions driven primarily by the United Nations or European powers is ending. On the one hand, I think this is a little unfortunate, because while their track record certainly hasn't been perfect, I don't think it's all that bad. There is really good evidence, for example, that on balance, UN-sponsored peacekeeping reduces armed conflict, prevents conflict recurrence, and it saves lives. MENUSMA certainly wasn't a perfect intervention, but I would argue it did basically all of what it was mandated to do in terms of enforcing the peace in the north. And the criticism it often gets, which was not adequately dealing with the terrorist threat, mainly in Mali center and south, were never things that it was mandated to do. So that's unfortunate. It means that there aren't very many great kind of large scale, options. I think if you do see future missions that are sponsored by the UN or Europe, they're going to have to come only with a very strong local demand signal. That was sort of where MINUSMA went wrong. The Malian government asked it to leave as a foreign power there at the consent of the host nation. There's not much you can do. You have to leave. I think UN assessed contributions, which for the first time will allow the UN directly to fund African Union-led peace operations. This was passed in December by the Security Council, offer a potential way forward. In a best case scenario, this will allow UN resources, expertise, and logistical capabilities, which, as Sebastian indicated, organizations like ECOWAS largely lack, to be aligned with some of these locally led efforts by ECOWAS, by the MNJTF, by the G5 Sahel, by other coalitions of African states, to address some of these conflicts, and importantly, also, as Sebastian mentioned, some of the underlying causes. I think there may be, over the medium term, some opportunities for assessed contributions in places like coastal West Africa or in the Lake Chad Basin in Nigeria. But absent even absent these interventions, I think it's clear we're going to see more regionalized interventions, like the MNJTF, like the G5 Sahel, like the Accra Initiative in Ghana, like the Alliance of Sahelian States. These really depend on close coordination, cooperation, and trust to ensure that militant groups can't exploit borders. And as Sebastian hinted at, they're not often that well resourced. They're I think outside of the MNJTF, their success has been frankly somewhat marginal. And if maybe UN-assessed contributions is a best case scenario for the future of regional cooperation, I think continued regional fragmentation like we're seeing today is maybe the worst. We've already seen the coup hit countries, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, pull out of collective security arrangements. And the problem is if this is truly a collective threat that spans borders, I'm not sure how it can easily be addressed without kind of better cooperation. In order to deal with the problem, there needs to be both a region-wide commitment to collective security and a prioritization of the threat from the violent extremist groups. But if governments aren't ultimately doing the things they do, not just to address the threat militarily, but also fostering legitimacy, as Sebastian pointed out, investing in economic, social, and development, addressing the political causes that give rise to extremism, there's really nothing any foreign power can do. I think this has been the conundrum faced by foreign actors for much of the past decade, and there is no easy way out.
All right, thank you for that. Kabir, I'd love for you just to take a moment, and if you could walk us through what are some of the factors and issues that, in your mind, are not being adequately addressed by current missions, and if I would love to hear your thoughts on what some alternative actions are that the international community, quite broadly, could take to meet those needs.
And thank you so much, Courtney. So some of the conversations that are ongoing at the moment, reflect questions around the mandate of the missions themselves. So as an example, where some of the UN missions are deployed for peacekeeping purposes, and then, of course, the conflict as such, where the implementation of that mandate is almost impossible without some elements of, force. It makes it very difficult. So this issue has come up repeatedly over time. But outside of that, the context on ground, the drivers of the conflict that most researchers and persons on ground feel are not necessarily being addressed is also another issue. So as an example, governance issues that are failing to meet the needs and demands of the people in the region, which are at the root of most of the conflict, and even the change. As an example, when we saw the coup in Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and more recently in Niger, they cited, three reasons actually. First off is the security challenge, the economy, and then sometimes corruption. So that is also a reflection. The fourth element is the legacy of the colonial era, which sadly, unfortunately, this is a huge issue, but it somehow affects the French colonies more than it does the more English colonies. So we've also seen that repeated itself constantly. As at now, there is no mechanism, as it were, for whether measuring or improving good governance. Democracy is being waived as the basis for some of the partnership and support aid and other arrangements that the region is enjoying. But in terms of holding to account the leadership of those countries to make sure they abide by the terms of those agreements, not much is being seen in that regard. And there is consensus that this is part of the reason why we're seeing more conflict in that region. The level of deprivation in the region is as such that perhaps there is a need to address that issue. Other areas that have also come up in research and in conversation is the security sector reform that has been implemented by development partners with the support of course, different players, stakeholders in the region. So just like my two other discussants have mentioned, over time, there has been some form of support either by the US government, the European Union in security sector reform and other components of security training. But the challenge that most observers have raised is where these types of interventions have failed to achieve the objectives, especially security sector reform, where till date, the military sees itself as the guardian, quote unquote, of democracy and feels obliged to intervene where there is a deviation, in their interpretation of that. And I think the other point, which is tied to the first point of governance, is what has been described as the failure of democracy in most of these countries. The dividends, quote unquote, of democracy is not being felt by the people. So these are all areas that I would say that require improvement. Earlier on, I did mention climate change and the inability of governments in the region to either adopt or implement some adaptation measures to reduce the impact and consequences of climate change. And then I also want to talk about geopolitics. Essentially, the region is a playground for the superpowers, as it were. Russia, China, the US, EU, and more recently countries in the Middle East, Turkey, the UAE, and several others have found a very veritable playground, as it were, in the region. So all of these are areas that I would say, if we're looking for improvement, we should focus on. There are other issues that I think are also very important, which includes the demographics that the region represents. There's a youth bulge in the region, and in most of the countries, the non-state armed groups that are active in the conflicts that we've identified earlier on, the bulk of the participants in that are the youths, and these youths are out of job. Most of them are not educated. And so addressing that particular demographic, including women, and improving participation. In Nigeria, as an example, the current government came in with the mantra of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's just about 8 months in place. And we're seeing indicators that are showing very good signs of that implementation of the DEI component. But we're not seeing enough of that in other countries within the region. So perhaps addressing that too. And then, of course, UN Resolution 2250, with particular reference to youth involvement, I think is also another area that perhaps if we encourage the implementation of the recommendations of that resolution, and perhaps a roadmap for that implementation across the region would also help address the youth bulge challenge that I mentioned earlier on.
Great, thank you. Yes, I find that intersection between the demographics and also what you mentioned, climate change, I think to be particularly interesting as well. One final question before I turn to the Q&A box. Sebastian, just kind of looking at success stories. Would you mind just talking a little bit about how regional actors have successfully dealt with issues of extremism and corruption, and what is the wider global implication of if this kind of success cannot be replicated across the region? So what is successful, yes, and what are the implications if we can't be successful?
So it cannot be denied that there have been many setbacks. I talked about the G5 Sahel and ECOWAS, and the other participants echoed this, but it cannot be denied that there's also been success and a kind of forward planning. And even though the media often takes a regional look, and we see this very much now that people talk about the coup search, there's often a tendency to kind of assume that all of these challenges and issues play out in every country in the same way, and that's of course not true. There are a lot of countries in the West African region or in the Sahel, and countries have dealt with these challenges in very different ways. I would argue, for example, that Ghana historically has been a very forward planning country with regard to security threats. And so there has been now for quite some time, for the last 5 years or so, really a great concern among Ghana's government officials and policymakers about the potential for violent extremism to spill over into Ghana. And I think that fear has risen with the military coups in Niger and with attacks in Ivory Coast and on the border to Guinea. But I think what Ghana, for example, has done is they have established a fairly tight-knit network of civil society organizations that are involved in kind of collecting information and in reaching out, working very closely with Islamic scholars in Ghana's north in order to identify hotspots and in order to react to potential sources of radicalization in a non-militaristic, more inclusive manner. I would also argue that Niger, certainly until the coup last year in July, has sought close links to its Islamic leadership and has been more successful maybe than Burkina Faso and Mali in containing the emergence of kind of homegrown Islamic extremism. That doesn't always show in the quantitative data, but if you take a closer look at where the hotspots are for Niger, they're almost all located in the tri-border areas. So on the border with Mali, with Burkina Faso, and with Nigeria. So in the case of Niger, one could argue that Niger has become very much a victim of the neighborhood that it is in. And just like Ghana, Niger has fostered the growth and the institutionalization of state institution that is reaching out to local communities. This is not a perfect setup, and of course it could be better, but that is success. I mean we never really see the kind of attacks or the radicalization that's been curtailed or that's been undermined by the state. So Chad also is a country, even though it has been deeply authoritarian, and I would argue it will remain deeply authoritarian under its new president, the current junta leader, is a government that has really fostered close interreligious dialogues between its Catholic population and its Muslim majority population. And it's really been the Catholic Church in in Chad, that's played a preeminent role in kind of reaching out to fundamentalist Muslim communities and in trying to strengthen and foster peace in areas that were under threat by Boko Haram propaganda or by Islamic extremist propaganda. So there are positive examples, and I think the solution for the future will be, on the one hand, to strengthen military capacities through regional integration, but really to strengthen soft approaches to radicalization. And that's something that Kabir has mentioned. Tackling or thematizing climate change, maybe thematizing the failure of the post-colonial state, thematizing corruption, instituting a better oversight mechanism, and bringing religious leaders on boards as kind of equal partners, because all of these countries are weak states, but weak states with very strong religious societies. So that is a resource when we talk about religious radicalization. And some countries, Ghana, Niger, and Chad, have been more successful in tapping into those resources than maybe Mali or Burkina Faso.
Terrific. Thank you. We have a lot of questions coming in the Q&A box, so I want to try to get to as many of them as I can. Kabir, I'd like to turn to you first. Someone would like to know, how do social programs and youth initiatives serve to increase peace and security in West Africa?
Like I explained earlier on, the bulk of the participants, both in terms of the actors and sometimes even the victims, represent the youth demographic. And so addressing that and reducing either in terms of the push or the pull factors that foil conflict, both in terms of their participation or sometimes their impact, would be a very good way of reducing or sometimes even containing those conflicts. In almost all the population, in the case of Nigeria, I think about 70% of the out of unemployed population are youths. And it's been proven that a significant percentage of that are vulnerable to recruitment, either as active participants or sometimes in the value chain that foils the conflict. And so addressing that, either in terms of just giving them skill sets or sometimes providing capital, or addressing some of the structural challenges that makes them, unemployed, would go a long way towards reducing their participation or their being victims in this conflict.
Terrific, thank you. Nate, we have a question here, and they write, how does continued foreign intervention and instability affect the ability of governmental institutions to uphold the rule of law in affected regions? And what challenges does this pose for establishing effective governance structures and maintaining stability?
Sure. So I think my answer to that question is that not all foreign interventions are created equal, right? I think I would argue that if you look at like UN peacekeeping missions who are explicitly there to uphold a peace agreement, lead to some kind of like political transition process, in those cases, I think they're pretty clearly efforts to produce stability and foster effective governance. But I also think, at times there are foreign interventions where you are in various respects kind of propping up repressive regimes who don't have a large interest in governing all of their territory. That you have very repressive responses by security forces, for example, in various regions of Mali and Burkina Faso. I think if you look, for example, at the interventions by Russians and the Wagner group, it's regime security, right? They're usually in it for some kind of resource extractive related purposes, and they care about keeping the government in power, less necessarily about kind of fostering inclusive governance that addresses underlying causes. So you can't paint all kind of foreign interventions with one brush. I do think though where oftentimes the big I international community goes wrong is assuming more responsibility than it ought to for kind of maintaining security provision, maintaining governance structures, et cetera. I think that to some extent, it serves the interest of some foreign actors to kind of inflate their sense of self-importance, to stay there, to pretend that what they're doing is absolutely essential. And it also, I think, enables regimes who in many ways are failing their peoples to cast foreign intervention as a scapegoat. I think, for example, the multidimensional integrated stabilization mission in Mali is a really, really good example of this, where from where I sit, it basically did everything that it was mandated to do. The main things that it was criticized for, which was not responding to the terrorist threat, were something that it was never explicitly mandated for. So that would be sort of my response to that question.
Terrific, thank you. Sebastian, someone would like to know from you if there are any discernible patterns or trends in the frequency and timing of coups in Africa over the past few decades, they write.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So as I said before, the media is very often now using the term coup search. I don't like this term very much because it's somewhat simplistic, and it assumes that all of these coups fell from the sky and civil military relations were never really an issue in the last 30 years. Now, it is true that in terms of the frequency and regional concentration, we're seeing something in Francophone West Africa, as Kabir rightly outlined. We see in a relatively short period of time, a relatively large number of military interventions, and that starts in Mali in August 2020, and it kind of reached its current climax last year in July with the military coup in Niger. And so we have, I think, in Africa as a whole, we have seen 7 military coups in that period, if you count the Sudanese coup as well. Prior to 2020, I think across the world between 1990 and 2020, we saw roughly 32 military interventions. So it is a steep increase. However, that's not to say that military coups were somewhat absent throughout the decades. If you look at a country like Niger, there were coups in 1996, 1999, 2010, and now 2023. So that's 4 military coups in kind of 3 decades. We also know there were a number of near misses, right? So countries that were close to experiencing military coups, such as Guinea-Bissau or maybe even Ivory Coast. And there is, of course, concern that we have not yet seen the end of that coup surge. Nate just said, not all foreign interventions are born equal. Not all military coups are born equal. And that will have implications. So I think in the case of Mali and Burkina Faso, the coup triggers are very clear. It's sort of very corrupt civilian governments that were seen as too close to France, as too close to the West, and a really rapidly deteriorating security situation. And I think we will not see the departure of those military leaders from power, simply because they derive a lot of support from civil society. I think the situation is very different in a country like Guinea, where there is no acute security threat. Okay, there have been a couple of attacks in the border area, but by no means is Guinea under the same security threat as Mali, Niger, or Burkina Faso. Gabon is another issue where there is no acute security threat, and we've seen a military intervention. And I think in Guinea and Gabon, the future is yet to be written, and it's not clear what the plans are of those military juntas. To me, Niger is really an enigma. The Nigerian civilian leaders, so President Bazoum, did not experience the same kind of domestic challenges that his counterparts experienced in Mali and Burkina Faso. And from my understanding, having done extensive research in Niger over the last 10 years, civil society is not solidly behind the junta. So I think we will see probably in the weeks and months to come different dynamics, different political dynamics emerging than in Mali and Burkina Faso. So yes, there is a higher frequency, and there is a concentration in former Francophone colonies, as pointed out. What the future trajectories are, I believe we will see very different trajectories. And those countries that are experiencing acute military threats through violent Islamic groups stand a much lower chance at redemocratization. That's also because countries that hold potential leverage over political developments in Burkina Faso and Mali, most notably the EU, but also the US, will take a pragmatic approach. And they will say, well, we don't concur with the junta leaders, but it's a fact that these countries are under military threat. So we cannot put these countries under sanctions. We cannot withhold all military aid or all military cooperation, because ultimately these problems might become Western security problems, and that will play into the hands of the junta. So there is a clear trade-off here between democratic reform and security, and the juntas in Burkina Faso and Mali very cleverly play on that trade-off that will have to be made by Western capitals.
Right. Thank you. Kabir, we have a question here about the impact of global economic trends on West African security. And you touched a little bit on the larger geoeconomic picture, but I'd love for you to just talk about what you see going forward, and then also what is the connection between business and security as you see it.
I mean, there are different dimensions of approaching this question. Number one, I think, is to contextualize the dependence of most African militaries on foreign, defense equipment, both in terms of importation and then the support that they get. What we've seen, for instance, is an increase in the budgetary provision for defense in most African countries. But with a concurrent, I would say, demand for more by most of the defense sector players within the African context, pointing to inflation, pointing to, in some countries, including Nigeria, the devaluation of the currency. And just to put this in context, in Nigeria, as an example, the devaluation is almost about 200%. And so where there is an increasing reaction that suggests, for instance, that the budget would not be enough to meet procurement requirements for most of this military. And then on the other hand, we are also seeing, as it were, a concentration or a focus of most countries towards that's the development partners and other players like we've discussed earlier. In the case of the US and EU, their focus has been on Ukraine, and so Africa has somehow been pushed to the background. And so all of this is playing out. But then in real economic terms, the consequences itself is an expansion of security challenges in most of these African countries. The more, for instance, the economies are going through the difficulties they're going through in Nigeria, as an example. I earlier on spoke about unemployment. A lot of the small and medium scale industries that are providing employment to youth and the other demographics have been folding up. And so more people are being churned into the unemployment market. And in turn, they're now becoming available for recruitment by the non-state armed groups that are active. And it's the same scenario in other West African countries. So unfortunately, the geopolitical component, the consequences of economic developments across the world, including the high energy cost that has been accentuated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, by development in the Middle East, specifically the ongoing conflict between Hamas and Israel. And then, of course, developments around the Red Sea. All of this is negatively impacting on the most African economies. And then let's not forget the effect of COVID-19 that is still being felt by most African countries. So unfortunately, the effect is huge and the consequences are also huge.
Okay. Thank you. Nate, we have a question that is looking at the contrast between this need for addressing collective challenges, while at the same time having what seems like the governance mechanisms between countries coming apart. And so could you talk a little bit about how countries can address how governments can potentially come together, and why are they not coming together right now in the face of collective challenges?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a conundrum because I think from a very grand strategic level, most countries in West Africa now face a similar threat from violent extremist groups of various kinds. And in theory, you would think it would be very much in their interest to take some of the collective security arrangements that have been established. I mean, the MNJTF, I think, was the first major one in the region, whereby basically countries in a region, border region that is threatened by an extremist group or a cross-border militant group threat agree to A, share intelligence, establish some kind of a joint command center, B, grant other countries the right of what's in this hot pursuit. So basically they can pursue militants across borders and sometimes conduct joint border operations. And I think particularly in the case of MNGTF, talking about sort of successful approaches to conflict, it's been pretty successful, I think, in no small part also because some of the military responses have been combined with humanitarian efforts to demobilize members of militant groups. I think, for example, both members of Boko Haram, the Nigerian, the insurgent group in the Lake Chad Basin, are actually forcibly recruited, which makes a demobilization program very, very, very important. So in theory, I think these are the kinds of arrangements that it is in the interest of most countries in the region to be subscribing to. Unfortunately, I think basically all of the other efforts, the Accra Initiative, the G5 Sahel that was mentioned by Sebastian, have in various respects foundered. I think, and they foundered in part because the main states in West Africa lack a certain degree of trust with one another. They're prioritizing, to some extent, it's difficult to foster cross-border cooperation, right? If you are a military junta in Niger or Mali or Burkina Faso and you are seeing very threats from your neighbors in Nigeria and coastal West Africa. Remember, like Sebastian was talking about the threat and ECOWAS invasion. So what are you going to prioritize? A potential military invasion by your neighbors, or the violent extremist threat kind of within your voters? They're not easy questions or answers. So I do think, kind of regardless of government type, there is an argument for interest-based cooperation on shared security challenges of various kinds. Whether that will happen or not, who knows?
$1 million question. Sebastian, we have a question here. The questioner asks, how do humanitarian crises resulting from foreign interventions and instability in West Africa impact the long-term well-being and livelihoods of vulnerable populations, such as women and children?
So that's a really fantastic question. And so the kind of promise of a lot of these junta governments in West Africa was that, once the incompetent French and the incompetent, corrupt UN people leave, it's really in our hands to resolve the situation, and we'll be much more capable in doing that. And so on the one hand, that has not materialized. On the other hand, and I really do not want to play up the record of junta governments. I want to be quite specific about this. But on the other hand, the performance of those national militaries has not been as disappointing as many have feared. So it is true that these governments have not beaten or resolved the violent extremist issue, but they have not yet, at least, done much worse than maybe the French did or than the UN did. And Nate already elaborated on the mandate of the UN, which I believe has never been communicated properly enough to local populations, and maybe that's by choice. Partly that's due, of course, to the mandate, and partly it's due to the fact that even though the French had a lot of soldiers on the ground, it was always clear that that wouldn't be enough on its own to beat the violent extremists. And in fact, Western military cooperation was designed to strengthen local militaries so that they could fight these security threats on their own. And that's not necessarily been unsuccessful. It was portrayed as being terribly unsuccessful, but what this doesn't account for is, of course, that violent extremists also strengthened their resources over the last 5 to 10 years by foreign fighters coming in. So we could debate back and forth whether that was success or whether it was failure. I think the answer is open-ended, but I do think that the Sahel countries cannot win by a withdrawal of humanitarian aid. We don't know what the situation is in those areas that are currently worst affected by the humanitarian crisis in Burkina Faso, Mali, and also in Niger, because there has been an enormous crackdown on local journalists and, of course, on the movements of Western officials. So it's currently very difficult to travel into these countries or travel out of these countries if you are on an official mission. So if you work for UCAP, which is a European Union security initiative in Niger, there were just 2 colleagues that have been held at the Niamey airport for over a week before they could travel out. And many of you will have heard about the detention of 49 Ivorian UN soldiers last year in Mali. So we don't know. We lack information because of a crackdown on journalists, because Western officials cannot move freely, but also because watching the local media in these 3 Sahel countries is essentially a return to the 1970s. It's very much propaganda driven. And those juntas have been incredibly successful in bringing people on board who can manage the information and misinformation flow on social media, but also on television and on the radio. And I believe this is actually where Russia comes in. So Russia comes in through military training, Russia comes in through commercial agreements, but Russia comes also in through disinformation and the control of the local media. So my honest answer to your question is we don't know. Chances are it's going to be worse than before. But because of the way these countries are currently governed and because of the lack of appetite in Western countries to become more involved in the Sahel and become more involved in West Africa, chances are the humanitarian situation is going to decrease further. With one caveat, and that's maybe encouraging, the kind of rains and the harvests in the Sahel region has been more encouraging in the last 2 years, and that's a good thing, and we should all be grateful for that, but that's not something we can count on. So right now we have a situation in which the security situation is not good or very bad, but the harvest and the rain have been okay or satisfactory. So in that sense, it's okay.
It could have been worse, it sounds like. So.
Exactly.
Kabir, we have a two-part question here. Someone wants to know your take on the recent opening of the border by the Nigerian government as part of lifting sanctions placed on Niger. And then secondly, what's the way forward on the farmer-herder conflict in northern Nigeria?
Okay, starting with the first question, which is the reopening of the border. Of course, that was initiated by ECOWAS, and because the Nigerian president is the chairman of ECOWAS, it was very difficult for a lot of people to distinguish between his role as the president and then, of course, the chairman of ECOWAS. And there's a lot of comments around that, narratives around that. Some suggest that it was a personal issue. Others also linked that action with his relationship with France. And then, of course, others also linked it with self-preservation, as it were. We've discussed the coup wave that was moving around the region, and then the concern was, would it come to Nigeria? And so there was a lot of narrative around the action. But irrespective of what the real reasons were, the threat of the action and so many other things failed, as it were. And so ECOWAS did a reality check, a reckoning, and then, of course, last month ordered a lifting of the sanctions and the reopening of the borders. And since then, we've seen several ECOWAS countries, including Nigeria, reopening their borders. What we haven't seen at the moment is a response from the Nigerian junta. They are yet to reopen their borders, despite the fact that most African countries have opened. We also haven't seen them even respond, as it were, formally or officially to the statement by ECOWAS. Rather, what we've seen is it's a strengthening of that Sahelian alliance that has been formed between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. From the point of view of the community and the economic consequences of relationship between the community, I think there is a general consensus that the resumption of economic activities between the various countries within the community is good for the growth of that community. However, there is also, I think, general consensus that the three countries, in terms of their contribution to the economy of the region, as it were, is so insignificant that if they do decide to go on their own without responding to this offer by ECOWAS, yes, it would have an impact, especially for these states that are coterminous, both in Nigeria and then the several other ECOWAS countries. But from a general point of view, the consequences will be so minimal on the African countries. The major worry is really the players that are influencing the decisions of this junta. So as an example, if Russia becomes a significant player in the region, especially in these three countries, what impact would, especially the use of Wagner as an instrument of foreign policy by Russia, would it have on the security of the region? If the junta, both three of them, emphatic and they remained on their decision to have Western countries exit their borders, as it were, will the replacement, the capacity that Russia will bring, or the capacity that the other players bring, would it be able to suffice? Would it be able to counter the threat elements that are currently active in this region? How long will that period take before the replacement becomes active? So all of these concerns are pointing to the fact that the current circumstances and realization that the Sahel remains the global hotspot for terrorism is not likely to change anytime soon, and that some of the consequences of that would continue to drive conflict within the region at the moment. Now, with regards to the second part of the question, which is the farmer-herder violence, there are so many variables involved in that conflict. Land use policies by governments within the region. Earlier on, we spoke about the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, climate change, then the transhumans that I think as a region has not been addressed properly. All of these are factors that would determine how these issues are addressed. Unfortunately, at the moment, a significant component of the measures that is being implemented by most governments, in particular the Nigerian government, is really the use of kinetic force, military force, unfortunately. So the drivers of the challenge are not significantly being addressed like I've listed them earlier on, unfortunately. So it appears to me that unless there is a significant change in how the issue is being addressed. At the moment, Nigeria is considering an initiative it calls the Coup initiative. And what it did is to set out some sums of money to address some socioeconomic issues affecting the nomadic communities. So schools, health facilities, some other economic variables would also be addressed. Now, unfortunately, the Hada community has pushed back to say they were not consulted in the evolvement of that particular policy, and they do not think that the policy will actually address that. And so this is some of what we're seeing across the region, where the policies don't seem to have involvement from their initiation to implementation of the communities that they are likely to affect. My intervention sounds gloomy, but unfortunately that's the reality on ground. And if the intention of a webinar such as this is to allow policy conversations and to allow variables that perhaps would determine better outcomes, then I think it's best that we speak about the challenges and then of course recommendations on how to better address the issues.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Kabir, Nate, Sebastian, this was a terrific conversation, clearly a lot of complex issues going on. Thank you everyone for participating, for asking questions. We do have a discussion tomorrow at 12, and that's on Putin's perpetual power. And for those of you who are in New York, I also encourage you to come to our gala at the end of April, on April 29th. It is our biggest fundraiser, so we can keep these events free and open to everyone around the world. So with that, I will let you all go. I know we're over time. Really appreciate all the terrific insights and in taking your time today and for the work you do. So thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Courtney.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.